All right, so this is going to be the first of a little mini-series on of tutorials about using the MASH network. Something I just started showing a couple years ago in intro class. I think it was maybe just to get a break from keyframing, but I really think this is an important thing for intro students to be exposed to, this whole idea of procedural generation, procedural modeling, whatever it is, procedural animation. So the MASH network is a way of starting with a clone or a copy or a prototype, if you want to think of it that way, and duplicating that in many different crazy ways. And the whole idea that you're setting up a series of instructions for where you would put an object, and you can always refer back to it. So this is maybe Houdini extremely light within Maya. But I think this is a great place to start if you're an intro level student. So let's go ahead and start. So the first thing is we need to have some kind of geometry that we're going to use. That's going to be our thing that we're going to copy and clone, duplicate, however you want to look at it, right? So I have this cube, so let's leave pcube1 right there. And then I'm going to switch over to the MASH tab here, if you haven't seen it before. So it seems like a weird naming. I don't know if it has an acronym or what it is. But this was created by a third-party company, I understand, Northframe, I think, and then folded into Maya several years ago. So the key of doing anything right at the beginning with a MASH network is you have to create a network, right? So you have a piece of geometry, but how do we want to duplicate it? How do we start MASH going? So within the tab, the shelf here, the first thing we're going to do is create this network. And I actually like this little icon. It shows a cube with the tendrils of a MASH network encasing it, right? This is the thing it's going to use. So if you'll notice here in the outliner, I have pcube1 highlighted. And if I click on the MASH network, you can see a few things have changed here. So we have a MASH network, right? I'm going to talk about that in a second. We can see that pcube1 is still there, but it's hidden. You can see that its name is grayed out. And then right next to it, we have the MASH repro mesh, the reproduction or reprototyped mesh or whatever. So the repro mesh. So this is a new mesh that is all of the clones, the copies that MASH went and created here, right? Let's turn on a little wireframe so we can see those little puppies easier. Okay, so so we have these new components, right? So the prototype here, it's still there. If I wanted to, I could toggle it on and off, and we will in a minute, where we can make some modifications. And you can see we have this output mesh that's come from the MASH network. And if we click on the network itself, it's actually created a series of nodes. And I already have mine docked, but let's just pull this out of here and close it. So if it doesn't show up, sometimes when you go into the, right now I'm in Maya Classic, and so I have the outliner here. I had already docked the little MASH outliner, if you want to think of it that way. You can also go to the MASH default, right? And sometimes within the preferences, it will load it here. Especially if you've used it before and you save it out, it will remember that in the preferences. So I have a graph editor. We're going to do some keyframe, and we'll talk about this whole craziness over here in a second. But it is helpful to have the little MASH outliner. So you're always going to create a MASH network. It's interesting. It's divided like you must press me to become MASH enabled. And then we'll click on the MASH editor here, and I'll just dock it right there, right? So I can toggle back and forth if needed. So you can see I have a MASH network, and then kind of indented here is the MASH distribute node. So whenever you create a network, you're going to have to spread the objects some way, one way or the other. So the very first thing is you're automatically going to get one of these distribute nodes, right? And we'll talk about that. If I click on the network, so there's three things that have been generated. So I have a MASH network, and this is just kind of like the little interface. Excuse me. So the interface that says, here are the little tools, little components that you can add to the network. We will do a couple of those as we go along. And as a default, it creates 10 little copies. For the life of me, I don't know why it's called a waiter. I'm sure there's an interesting story there. I haven't researched that yet. But so when we click on the MASH network, this is usually when we're adding things like a delay or an offset or some noise to the distribution of these objects or some other parameter. We'll talk about that later. All right, so it also creates, as we talked about a second ago, the repro. So it, in here, so this is important, it took the cube object and it put it in here and it said, hey, I'm going to duplicate this, and then this is the thing it's working from, and then it outputs some geometry based on whatever we do with the distribution of it, right? Nice thing about this is later on, if we decide, hey, I don't want a cube, I want a sphere, I could put a sphere in here. I could put multiple objects in here and tell MASH to randomly select the 3 tree meshes that I have in here. It's a great way to create a forest, right? We'll talk about that later. All right, and then we have to distribute. So this is just its default. So do not get fooled into thinking like, oh, it's always going to go so many units to the x. It's just a default. And all the little tools or nodes, I guess is what they call them, all the nodes that are over here in MASH come with some kind of default, right? So there's like, hey, let's randomly rotate it 10 degrees, or let's randomly offset it 1 unit in X, Y, Z. So there's always some kind of default, and in this case, it's always the default to do linear and a distance of 20, in case that's what you want, right? For this one here, actually, I don't want to do 20 in the X. I was thinking maybe let's do the, well, maybe we will do the, let's leave it in the X, and I'm going to say just 10, right? You can see that it's putting those little copies there. We'll leave it at 10 for now, right? And that's about, you know, this is just the basic setup of it. I could make it 25, right? And so an important point here, and we'll talk some more about this in a second. So I have the number of points, and then obviously where do I want to, what's the distance of the total offset, right? So it's going to move from here to the very last one 10 units, and it's going to divide that in there so that we have 25 units, right? So if these cubes, and these cubes were 1 by 1 by 1, so if I'm going to have that to get a pretty close even distribution, right? You can see that if I'm going to have 25 copies, maybe I should move it 25 units over here, right? This could also be hundreds or thousands of units, right? Or copies if I want. Obviously, the more you add, the more, you know, complexity and more likely your machine's going to slow down doing some of this. So I always recommend just use just a fair number so you understand what the tool is doing, right? So let's just start with a 10. All right. So the thing I want to do in this little exercise is create a little animated staircase where my scene pops up here. And the one thing about this is the thing I'm going to use here later on is this scale function, right? So now I've said, hey, not only move 10 units, but also every time, by the time you get to the end here, scale this 10. I'm going to have a floor here, and I don't really care if we're having a staircase. It's in the bottom. So I'm going to make some modifications to the p-cube prototype object, which is an important concept here. So in fact, I'll just leave that there. I'm going to go over to the cube and unhide it. So an important part is that well, there are many important parts, right? I've said that like 10 times. But this is a really core concept here, is that the MASH network always wants to create things from the center of the world, for the most part. We'll see other variations to that in later tutorials. But in this case, the cube is set up right in the middle. The MASH network wants to set it up right in the middle. And then there are other tools to move it to new locations or animate it later on. But this is just, for efficiency, this is what MASH wants to do. And it takes that prototype. And remember that any object within Maya is actually two things, two nodes, right? There's a thing that says, I exist here in space, and then there's a shape node that happens to say, hey, I'm a cube, and I have points over here, or I'm a sphere, right? So there's a relationship between the pivot, or the transform node, and where the vertices and the edges and the polygons are, right? So if I right-click on this little thing, and I go to, did I do that right? I can do faces or I can do vertex, so I'll just do vertex, right? So select those. If I move them up, right, in this space, oops, looks like I didn't get all of them. oops, I know what I did. There we go. You want to make sure that I'm just working on the prototype object. And I'm leaving the MASH object visible just so that you can see the change here. Normally I would hide this as I make this, but I need you to see what the difference is here. So I've selected these points, right? And you can see if I move the object up, let's just go to a side view here. Right, if I move those vertices up and kind of position it there, you can now see that all the copies, the scaling is happening just in this vertical. And it's because it's scaling from, if I right click and I go back to object mode and I select the cube, select, there we go, you can see that the pivot is at the very bottom, right? So the relationship between the pivot and where the object is set up is very important. Like we'll do one more here. I'll just do it face mode, I guess. Right? So all I'm saying is, all I'm doing here, and this is the very powerful concept, is I'm changing what the prototype looks like, right? And I'm not scaling it as an object. I'm just, I'm scaling its components, right? This is a very important part of this. So I'm leaving the transform. I'm not moving it anywhere. If I just go over to its transform node, you can say 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1 for the scale. So I haven't done anything with that, right? And this is, so I'm relatively set up. You see I have a staircase. This is pretty quick, right? In fact, we'll leave that there. Let's go ahead, we'll just call that good for our stair. I'm going to hide the prototype. And I'm going to go back into the MASH network. One thing here is I'm going to just scale this at 9. So instead of going 10 units, I'm going to go 9 because the first one is counted, but it's not moved, actually. So I'm doing a little bit of subtraction. And the steps, that's maybe a little much. So we'll do this little running set of steps. All right. So now you get to suffer through some math here. So this is the important thing I want to, that's going on here. Oh my God, a spreadsheet, right? We're in an art class. What's going on? So I just wanted to show this like as the idea that it's important to remember that there is a list of objects getting created here. Okay. So I set this up as my little example. So you can see I have an ID. And computers like to start counting from 0, right? So the first one, p cube 0. So we've taken a prototype and we've put it in there and it says, hey, I'm a p cube. And then we can modify any of the attributes within the MASH network. And this could be an extensive, long list of all the things we wanted to change. But here what I've done is just shown the position z and the scale y, which if I go back over here, this is what we did, right, in the distribute. Oh, actually I did it in x. Well, I'll leave it as x. You get the gist of this. I've already scaled that object in that direction, so I'm not going to change it. But so it could be x or it could be z. It doesn't matter. But if I change this, what is happening with that total, so let's say it's 20. Right? So you can see it says this is the total, and I have 10 of these. So I'm going to divide that so they get little incremental units. So each time it goes, it tries to fit itself within that total range, right? So if I change that, or obviously if I change the number of IDs, that would be different. And the same thing here with the scaling. So let's put that back to 9. Right? And so we have the Y scale here that's at 5. So you can see that's being distributed. And I actually wrote this, my little expression that's in here in numbers or Excel, has a little +1. And oops. The reason I've done that is because the scale of the object, the little prototype, had a scale of 1. And when you use the distribute network, the attribute, it's just multiplying on top of that, right? So I have a scale of 1. So it's actually made a scale of 6 because this already had a scale of 1. So it's just adding to that. It goes along. So sometimes it takes it and there's an absolute value assigned to like a rotation or a transform. Other times there's it's a multiply, so it's adding to it or compounding it as it goes along. Sorry, let's get rid of this little notification there. Okay, so you might be like, big whoop, why would I care about this? All right, so again, it's important here. So I have this spreadsheet. And right now it's just distributing this. But remember, all these separate instructions, there's many, many different things that I could have it do. I could put random variables in here to say, when you get to number 3, do something different. When you get to number 4, do something different. What we're going to do is say, let's do an animation for our cubes so that they animate in the scale, and then we're going to put a delay on it. So it says, oh, ID number 0 has an animation on it. I'll start playing right at the very beginning. And then when I get to ID number 1, so the second cube, let's do that same animation, but let's start at 10 frames later, and then 10 frames later, and then 10 frames later, right? So it just goes on and on. So I just think it's really important to understand that there's a list of clones that we've created, and as we use, just remember that each one of them has separate sets of instructions that are similar to each other, but they are different one way or the other. So let's go back to this. So how are we going to animate the MASH network? So we set this scale at 5. I'm just going to put it down to 0, right? So you can see that it is, I wonder if what would it do? As you can see, it like tapers off from 0 all the way to -1 across there. Right? So I'm just going to leave it at 0. And at frame 1, I'm just going to set a keyframe. I'll set a key. And maybe I'll go to frame 20, and I'll put this up to 5. Right, so I can even see this in the animation curve. Now, it doesn't really work very well in the channel box. You're going to have to use the attribute editor to see a lot of the things in the MASH network. You're like, hey, whereas you can see it all here, but it gets complicated. So you can keyframe in this, but I think the attribute editor for intro students is better. So I have this set from 0 to 5, right, and it goes through this this little setup. Right, and you see it totally raises. That's okay. I mean, if nothing else, you're like, oh, great, I don't have to individually animate that, but this could be much better. So let's go back to the MASH network, and we're going to add a node to this, and we'll look at the MASH editor as we go along. So right now we have distribute. I'm going to come over to the delay node, and I'm going to click on it, and anytime you click on these in the this little selection menu, this little window will pop up. So do you want to add a delay node? It's basically asking a question. So I'll click on that. And you can see that this has now been added. And there's an order of operations, right? And MASH network says, let's go to the bottom. And first we distribute it. And then let's delay it. And then if we put other things in here, like randomly place them in different areas or whatever. So the order of these can be important. You can see there's a little textured tab right there. And so you can grab that and reorder things in the MASH network later on. We're not going to do that right now. So I have the delay node, and you can see it over here. It has a delay mode of what it's doing. Let's just say that this is, I don't know, 5. So this should be the offset of that, that step. So I'll come back over here. Right. So you can see now we're getting somewhere where you've got this little delay happening. And I can change this. Let's make it a little bit longer maybe. So now I have this system of animation that's unfolding. And you can see I can make all these changes. Can you imagine like doing all the keyframe for these and then turning around and someone saying, I think it should be quicker or slower, or it should have more randomization in it and how it works. Right? So the random's not a great example here, but you get my point. So I'll leave that. Oops, sorry, put the strength up there. Okay. So another thing like this is we're keyframing. Don't forget to animate this just like you would animate, say, the ball. So I'm going to go to frame 25. I'm going to go back to the distribute, and I'm just going to put a keyframe there. And I'll put another keyframe there. I'm just putting them in there so I get enough of them, and I'll hit frame. And with these selected, you can see I don't have the little tick marks here. So if I select anything that's keyframed over in the attribute editor that isn't normally visible over here will show up. So now maybe what I do is let's go to the absolute value. So I'm just offsetting these so that I get something like this. Ooh, nice, right? right? So you can see, obviously, a whole system of animation here is just going on. And there's so many different things I can do with this, right? And this is just that first node that we've been using. Right. So the whole idea is I create a short little animation that has 30 frames, and then I have a delay node that says, you know what, every, the time step, the average, and I believe it's just what that offset it should be. You could add variance to it, like how this works. Right, so maybe we make that little time variance just like, let's get 3. All right, so it just has a little shift. Maybe I'll turn that up a little. Right, so it just has a little more randomization as it's going on. It's kind of nice. So I'll just leave it at the default. As you can imagine, there's so many different things you could do with this. I'm not even talking about all this other stuff in here. All right, so let's get back to the core of this, the distribute node. So as you can imagine, we could animate, say, the distance. You know, maybe actually we want this to be spread out so that they're not touching with each other. Right? There's always the chances for me to change what is happening in the system very quickly. I'll leave this back at 9. I could randomize the Z scale if I wanted to. So let's put this back at 0. Sorry, I went the wrong one. Right, so maybe they're offset from each other a little bit. Put these back here. The last thing I want to show, so obviously you can mess with these a whole bunch, is the ramps. So when these are being animated in just the simple distribute node, you can change the ramps themselves to affect the intensity, I guess is the good way of putting it. So let's just take this. We did animate, and we have changed the scale and how that's happening. We've also changed, put a value here into the distance, so I can change how these move along a curve. So this just says move this linear, so it just takes these numbers, right, and it divides them evenly as it goes along. But we can put a little, this little graphic representation is going to mess with the math so that I can change some of this. Maybe I want this set of stairs to animate this way. Right? That's kind of nice. Right? So hopefully you see the power of all these things put together. This is, again, just the simple distribute nodes. There's so many different things. You might be like, well, this is great for a set of stairs. We could do radial, we could do spherical, we could randomly populate this along the surface of a mesh. We could use other dynamic point sources, a grid, through a volume. We could say, here's a sphere, randomly cram all these into a bunch of cubes into that object. And obviously, we haven't even started talking about all the different things that we can animate here. We just started with delay. Again, the delay itself, this is for anything that we keyframe in the distribute, or anything we keyframe in the MASH network with its MASH values, we can use delay and offset how those happen. There is also a time node. So if you're keyframing, like say the ball or the boxy rig, so the things that you animate there in those keyframes, not all of that stuff, but most of it, it can be offset here. That can be a little slow sometimes, so I would stay away from that until you're familiar with the MASH a little bit further. But the delay is a great place to start. Okay, wow, 25 minutes. Covered a lot. Created a little animation of a fancy snazzy staircase, right? With the kind of exponentially increasing staircase. You even were subjected to a spreadsheet to impress upon you that the MASH network is just creating a list, right, of all these cubes that have similar but different properties. Keep that in mind at all times. And subsequent videos, we'll get in there and try a whole bunch of other stuff. All right. Hope you enjoy.